Well, good morning. Today I'd like to start a new series on meditations on modern gods. That is, the things that we worship today, which we may not think of gods, but which probably should be considered religiously. And the first thing is political power, what the old King James calls principalities and powers, and what the modern versions call something like rulers and authorities. Here's Titus 3 verse 1. Remind the people to be subject to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready to do whatever is good, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and always to be gentle toward everyone. So we're to be subject to the rulers and authorities and obedient, and whenever they tell us to do something good, we are to do it. But here's Ephesians 6, which suggests that we have to in some way defend ourselves against the rulers and authorities. Put on the full armour of God so that you will take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes you may be able to stand your ground, and after you've done everything, to stand. So we are to be subject to the principalities and powers, but we are also sometimes to defend ourselves against them and resist their influence. Now, some people like to draw a distinction between political and spiritual powers, but I don't think that works with Ephesians 6, because Paul himself makes a distinction between the powers of this dark world and the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. In other words, between the evil spirits and the powers of this age. And I think political power always has a religious side to it. In those days, of course, Roman emperors claimed to be gods, and there were temples to the genius of the emperor and temples to the goddess Roma, who was supposed to be the wise spirit guiding the city of Rome to its current domination of the world. But we still get something like that today. The very close relationship between the British royal family and the Anglican Church is interesting. The head of the Anglican Church is apparently not Jesus, it is Her Majesty the Queen. And I remember my days in Anglicanism, how central the royal family was to that religion. And anyway, rulers will always use the language and rituals of religion, even if they claim not to be religious. I can't think of anything more religious than the atheist assemblies of fascist or communist rulers with their language of glory and sacrifice, their ritual mass rallies, which look to me very much like worship ceremonies. And even if you don't call yourself a fascist or a communist, you need only look at some of the political rallies that happen under other banners to see that actually there is something very much similar to a kind of homage being paid. Now, when Christians see the powers in action, the political powers, there are two common responses. The first one is to cooperate more than we should. Some of us retreat into a religion that is so private that we can also do whatever the powers of the age demand. Passivity, sometimes called pietism. These are the people who make such a sharp distinction between the material life and the spiritual life. And they feel as long as their spiritual life is in good nick, they'll do whatever the government tells them to do. This has happened time and again through history, that Christianity has been so spiritualized that it has really nothing to do with real life. The next stage after simply retreating is cooperation. And there are some versions of the Christian religion which actually seem to be designed to support and sustain the political powers. Most of the armed forces of Europe in World War II had chaplains attached to the army, helping the soldiers to do their duty, giving spiritual support to combatants on both sides of the war. That's a kind of actual support, isn't it, really, of the powers that be. Orthodox archbishops apparently mentor today the president of Russia. And even President Trump has a spiritual advisor, a lady called Paula White, who does seem to be a bit of an odd character herself, but then so does President Trump. Look her up on Wikipedia if you want. So some forms of the Christian religion actually are, if you like, in favour of one political force or another. Another point of view of Christians is well, political power is so important, we better get a bit of it. So there is that idea that if only we had the levers of power, we could make the world a better place. Not entirely dissimilar to what the devil suggested to Jesus. History actually gives us very little evidence of that ever working. There are examples of great men like Alfred the Great who seem to have been Christian believers and also seem to have been competent and wise rulers. But for every Alfred the Great, there's a Tsar Nicholas II who seems to be equally devoted, but spectacularly bad at ruling. So I'm not sure that Christians are any better at being kings and governors than anybody else. Tony Blair professed to have a Christian faith, Theresa May, but were they any better than the other prime ministers we've had? I've met a few Christian MPs through the years and they've all struck me as being amazingly ineffectual. The truth of the matter is that either we don't manage to grab the levers of power, or if we do manage to grab them, we don't seem to do any better job than the unbelievers. So occasionally there have been revolutionary Christians. They're the ones who say, okay, no good sharing power, we'll take it ourselves. I suppose the best British example is the New Model Army, which was full of Baptists and other nonconformists who managed to get the king beheaded back in the 16th century, but in the long term were ineffectual. The Peasants' Revolt in 16th century Germany seems to have been at least partly inspired by the new habit of Bible reading amongst Germans. And in the middle of the last century there was a thing called liberation theology, which developed, again claiming that it was the church's job to help the oppressed seize power. It was always a bit of a hobby of a few odd Catholic priests, but it was interesting how much it frightened so many British and American evangelical Christians. In fact, I would say the biggest effect of liberation theology was to show just how right-wing most evangelicals were, devoted to liberal capitalist systems of power. So we can't take power ourselves very easily. When we share power, we're pretty rubbish at it, and sometimes we just roll over and do what we're told. I don't think the Apostle Paul would be impressed with any of that stuff. He knew very well you can't Christianize the powers, the principalities and powers. In fact, the more you try to seize the powers, the reins of power, the more you'll just turn into another version of the problem. So here's the strange thing. We are to be subject to the principalities and powers. And that's painful and difficult. I can't imagine that when the people of Crete were told by Titus to be subject to the Emperor Caligula or Nero or whoever it was, that felt particularly easy. On the other hand, we can never give them all our loyalty. We can never give them complete obedience. We are to do good if we're told to do good. But political power always has a demonic element. That's why the term principalities and powers has that double meaning. Jesus exposed the principalities and powers on the cross. He shamed them. He disarmed them. He showed that the power structures of this world are inherently wrong and corrupt. But he subjected himself to them, even to the worst possible extent. So there we are. We can't be rebels, but we can't be doormats. We can't try to overthrow the powers that be, because that will just turn into another version of abuse. But we can't just do whatever we're told. We have to live for Christ, and every so often we will object and we will say no to the principalities and powers. That's not easy. But then nobody ever said following Jesus would be that easy. And we live in this present passing age where evil is present, but we look forward to an age to come where the only principality and the only power will be the righteousness of God. Until we're there, we are in this strange relationship with the powers that be, neither rebels nor doormats. I hope that makes sense, and we'll look at another modern God tomorrow. Bye for now.